series of Thanks Before the No, where God says no, God does difficult things that we may not like, that we may not enjoy, but we thank Him for them because there's a lot of good that comes from them. And we're going to talk this morning probably about one of the most universally familiar stories in all of the Bible, and it's David and Goliath. And we thank God for the giants. We may not want to, we may look at giants and we may be intimidated, we may be scared, we may wonder how things are going to come out if we can be victorious. But giants in our lives are a good thing. And I think if we would start to share stories, we would realize that we all have a lot of giants, or have had a lot of giants in our lives. Giants, some of the giants in my life, one was school. I've shared some of that before. The struggles that I had with school and the struggles that schools had with me as their student because of the way I behaved and the way I acted. And so school was a giant for me, but yet as I went through school, it was interesting. As I went through, I found my grades going up and being more successful in school because maybe of some of the struggles I had earlier in school, where when I got to college, my GPA went up. When I got my master's degree, my GPA went up. And I think it's all because of some of the struggles I had earlier in life. And we all have struggles. You look back at marriage and relationships, and you can see struggles that were giants at the time. And probably most people who experience, I think most people who are married, that they realize they go through a period of time where they wonder, are we going to make it? I think those first 3 years are really difficult, and you wonder, man, are we going to make it to the end? Are we going to stay married? Are we going to choose? How are we going to choose to fight? How are we going to choose to survive? And we face those giants through our life and through our marriage. We face them with our children. We face them in our careers. We face giants frequently in our life. And one thing I love about the story, we're going to get to in a little bit, is about how God prepared David to face the giant. And how God prepares us to face our giants. And we don't know how we're going to accomplish it, but we do, because God has prepared us. I'm going to read, take your Bibles, 1 Samuel. The first and the seconds in the Old Testament are all together, so if you find you're in the first and the seconds, you're getting close. 1 Samuel chapter 17, or open your phone app. There's a Bible in front of you can use. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and read the first 3 verses, and then we're going to jump to verse 32. But here it is, 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Soko, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and Judah and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. I'll take a pause right here before we jump. I'm going to show you some pictures of what we're looking at. So if you want to reference the verses as you look at the pictures, this is up on top of, I'm just going to pronounce it Soko. I know that's not the Hebrew pronunciation, but it's easier because you got to have that in there to pronounce. I don't want to spit all over the place. So this is up on top of the hill looking down into the valley, okay? So you can see kind of for reference up on the top right-hand corner, there's a person walking there, so it gives you a little bit of scale to the size of this hill, to the size of those rocks. So if you're up on top of this hill, you're looking down into the valley, okay? This next picture is kind of down in the valley looking back up the hill. So if you're an army, this is what's facing you. So if you're charging, you're going up this hill. You're not just facing an army, but you're going up it. You can see a path going up through that little ravine to kind of the left center there. You see the size of the rock. So you're not only attacking an army, you're having to navigate these boulders that you just can't step over. So there are natural barriers that you're going to have to face to attack an army who is occupying the high ground. Okay, so both armies are on this high ground. You can see, here's an aerial view of the topography. You have the valley running through the center. Back, you have the Judean hills. You have that hill that we were just looking at. to the right center there. Next picture. So here's a lot of information from a little bit different angle. So you have the Philistine camps on the left side of the picture, the Philistine camp on the far side of the valley, and then on the near side you have the Israelite camp. Okay? Seeing how they're kind of facing each other, how they could see each other and observe, and you can see the valley where Goliath would have come down and shouted up at the Israelite camp. And we have one more picture. So here's so dead center. You see the creek where David would have grabbed his stones. You have the valley again, the two different camps where they would have been. Is that the last picture? We got one more. That's the last one. So this just gives you a visual of what we're looking at and what the armies would have been looking at. So you have the army on one hill, the Philistines on the other hill. They can see each other, they can hear each other. Because the distance here, the valley width is only about 1/4 of a mile wide right here. So it's not a big space. So you got thousands of people and each army's on opposite hills. Nobody wants to attack. Because to attack, you've got to come down into an open valley and cross and go up through a really difficult slope to attack an entrenched army on a hill, on high ground. Nobody wants to do that. So they're kind of waiting for the other person to make their move. They're waiting for the other person to do something. They can't really turn around and run because now they've exposed their backs to the army and they're not in a position to fight. So they open themselves to attack. So here they are on top of these mountains, Goliath coming down into the valley, shouting up at the Israelites. They can see this, they can hear this. It's all very easily observed. Like I said, it's about a 1/4 mile is all across here, so Goliath will walk down twice a day, shout. This valley is only about 4.5 miles long. So this is the scene. This is the context. And David comes to, you can see where Saul's camp is there. David would come from behind, walking through those hills, up into the camp, sees what's happening, observes the valley, observes the other army, talks to Saul. Saul would have been on the highest ground, looking down and watching all of this. Okay? So this is the scene. Now we jump down to verse 32. We're going to skip some of this story, go back and read it if you're not familiar with it. But in verse 32, David says this. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. He has been a man of war since his youth." Now, David at this age probably would have been 13 to 15 years old, something like that. But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." Then Saul gave David his own armor and bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones, remember that stream, that creek? 5 smooth stones, dry riverbed, from a stream, and put them into a shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with a shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Now remember, everybody's watching. Everybody's watching up on the high ground, looking down. They see Goliath, this mammoth of a man. You can look at the basketball hoops, those are 10 foot tall, right? Goliath is 9.5 foot tall. Here comes a little 13 to 15-year-old boy strutting across the valley. This image is powerful. I forgot where it was. 41, thank you. Goliath walked out towards David with a shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Ruddy-faced means red. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will I will kill you and cut off your head, and then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword or spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran to meet him. Reaching into a shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with a sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath tumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. Slingers, so David the sling. I don't know about, maybe you had a slingshot when you were a kid. Mostly boys, a couple of girls. You know, we had an old thing put on the rock. These slings are the ones that you kind of whip around, right? You can watch YouTube videos of these things. The sling is like 6 feet long. They would whip this thing around. The stones that they would use, I kind of used to think when I was a kid that they were just like small little stones, like I would throw. Well, these stones are about the size of a baseball. They would pick up. And they'd put them in this pouch, and they would whip these things around. And they could hit, if you look back at Judges chapter 20, I think it is, in Judges chapter 20, it talks about 700 slingers who were warriors. And they could hit within a hair's breadth a target. So I was watching some YouTube videos this week of this, not just watching YouTube videos, I was watching of modern day slingers. And at 100 feet, they were hitting bullseyes, one after another, after another, after another. These guys were accurate with their slings. And it says historically that they were effective up to 100 yards. So they could whip these things a football field and be effective as slingers. Slingers were actually the guys who protected the archers. So the archers weren't backing. The archers, they would shoot their arrows high into the air, and just a swarm of arrows would come down on the army, kind of indiscriminately. They could shoot them over walls of castles, whatever, but they would be, at a distance, firing these arrows over the army into the other army, where out in front would be the slingers. Out in front, they were considered snipers. Whereas somebody would set up at a castle, and they could whip that stone and knock off people as snipers in castles and in other places. These guys were deadly accurate. These stones, like I said, about the size of a baseball, they would throw them at about 100 miles an hour. They could whip it about 100 miles an hour, and I was doing some reading, and they would hit with the impact or the force of a 45 slug handgun. So that's the impact that they would hit with. They did some testing. It takes about, here's some just science, I'm just being a nerd this morning, about 3,000 newtons of force to kill a person. A sling could hit with about 3,600 pounds, 3,600 newtons of force. So more than enough force to kill. So we think of David as this unarmed, what's this sling? David was effective. I mean, if you've ever watched The Boys, and they go out and they're just watching sheep or whatever, I have this image in my mind of David in a sling, and he's hitting frogs, and he's hitting toads, and a sheep kind of messes up, and he just kind of whips it, and he thumps the sheep in the hind parts just to get it to behave. And David is just practicing constantly with his sling. He's constantly whipping it, constantly throwing it, and he's highly effective. But what I find interesting in the story is that when he gets to the lion and the bear, he says, I grab a club, and I club the thing. I mean, David is tenacious. David is kind of one of those guys who's kind of looking, man, he's not my kid. Because he's just this, he's confident, he's skilled, and he knows himself, and most importantly, he knows his God. He sees his God, how he works, and what he has accomplished. As I look at the story, one of the other things I know about giants is that giants are persistent. You ever notice that? Giants in your life, they don't tend to just go away. If you ignore them, they don't tend to just stop being giants in your life. If a giant in your life is a relationship, that giant doesn't just go away. Relationship issues just don't solve themselves, do they? If school, like it was for me, that giant just doesn't go away. You're faced with it every day. If finances are a giant in your life, those giants just don't go away. Giants are persistent. They're constantly in your face. They're constantly demanding your attention. They're constantly demanding that you address them, that you do something about them. Now, this camp, the Israelites are up in this camp. They're watching. They know that something has to change. They don't know what. They don't know when. They don't know how. But something has to change. They can't go anywhere. They're stuck. They can't go left, they can't go right because of the mountains, because of the valley. They can't turn around and go because now they expose their weakness and they'll be attacked. They can't really attack and move forward because just of the terrain, you saw the terrain, that's not an option. So they're stuck. Same with giants in our life. We're stuck. We have to face them. We have to deal with them. Giants are persistent. If you look back and check at verse 16, I think it is, verse 16, for 40 days, every morning, every evening, day after day after day, Goliath didn't take a day off. He didn't take a Sabbath day because he didn't believe in that. Day after day, for 40 days, Goliath is coming out insulting them, mocking them, making fun of them, ridiculing them, embarrassing them. Don't giants do that frequently in our life? Whatever that giant is that you face in your life, we can feel ridiculed by it because of what it is. We can feel insufficient. We can believe we're insufficient. And the entire Israelite army believed they were insufficient. We can't defeat this guy. We can't do anything about it. We're completely inadequate. Giants make us feel that way, don't they? That we're inadequate. We're not smart enough. We're not good enough. We're not equipped enough. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough this. We don't have enough that. We can't do it, but yet the giant doesn't go anywhere. The giant faces day after day after day after day. One thing I discovered about this story, and you keep discovering about God, is God does crazy stuff with small things through faithful people. You look at this story, and the story is just crazy. I mean, think that Goliath is as tall as this basketball hoop. And here is David, probably all of 5 foot nothing. David has got nothing on except his robe and his sling, and Goliath is dressed in probably about 250 pounds worth of armor. Just his armor, with his coat of mail and his helmet and his sword, and somebody else carrying a shield. He's got armor on top of armor. He's a huge man. And here's David staring up at him. God does crazy things. The small things through faithful people. It's just David who said, you know what? I know who he is and I know who God is. And I don't care who he is. I don't care how big he is. I don't care how tall he is. Saul, I don't care how experienced soldier he is. I don't care about the armor. I don't need any of that because I have God on my side. We all face giants, don't we? We all have right now that you can think of a giant in your life. It may be health related. It may be emotional. Maybe depression is a giant that you face on a regular basis. Your own physical condition, family, relationships, etc. These giants that we face on a regular basis are constantly coming at us, constantly screaming at us, constantly telling us that we aren't good enough, that we aren't smart enough, that maybe we get to doubt who God is, as Israelites did, as the army did. But you look back at this and you see how David remembers. If you go back through Scripture, when you see remember, you need to circle that. You need to underline that. Because God is calling people's attention back to something that He has already done, back to something that He has already accomplished, back to an example that He has set of who He is. What does David do here? David says, no, I remember. I remember the lion and the bear. I remember that I was able to defeat them, and I remember what God has done in my life to help me protect the sheep. And in David's mind, this is really no different. But I don't think that David would have been so confident in his ability to defeat Goliath if he hadn't been prepared through the lion and the bear. So we get to our giants today, right? We get to those things that we're facing today, and it's huge, and it's massive, and it's overwhelming, and it's discouraging, and it's depressing, and it's hard, and we have no clue how we're going to do it. We need to remember. We need to remember what God has done in our past. You know, for my schooling, I remember being in college and looking back at I was able to do that. I was able to accomplish that. Well, if I was able to get a decent grade on that paper, I could get a decent grade on this paper. I can accomplish this. We have all of these different examples in our life. If Becky and I could get through this argument, we can get through the next argument. If we can survive this, we can survive anything. If I can be homeless and employed once, well, I can do it a second time. The conversation I had with my mom when I was going to my junior year of college, it was a summer, we didn't have enough money. We didn't know what we were going to do. So going into my junior year, man, what are we going to do? How are we going to accomplish? How am I going to go back to school? I remember we were standing in the kitchen, and I think it was this God joined back in my mind the memory and saying, no, God has been faithful. We believe that God has called me to this school. He has called me to this career. He has called me here. We believe this. And Mom and I are talking. We're interacting. We're affirming each other. We're remembering. We're confirming. Like, if God has called us here and He's led us here, certainly He will provide money for the future. I'll go back to school. And God showed up. I don't even remember how. I got my diploma. I got my degree, so I finished. So somehow God showed up, and I remember His faithfulness. And then as as I get into life and as I begin to struggle with finances, I remember how God provided my junior year of college. So as I go farther, I remember now the story of how He provided this time and then how He provided the last time back. And now it starts to stack. These stories start to stack on top of one another, these examples that we can remember of God's faithfulness and God's blessing and God's grace and God's mercy. And then one giant after another falls. So you think about David's life, and David is somewhere between the ages of 13 and 15 when he's facing Goliath. How old do you think he was when he faced the lion and the bear? 10? I don't know. We don't know. He was younger. But God started stacking stories and stacking His faithfulness and leaving an example and leaving a legacy in David's life that David remembered when he faced his giant. The thing about giants is we don't know what the next giant is. And when David first looked at that lion, I'm sure as a, let's say, 10-year-old boy, I'm sure it looked like a giant to him. And then the bear seemed like a giant. Facing the ridicule of his brothers early in the story, part of the story that we skipped over. Probably seemed like a giant. You got all your older brothers who are seasoned soldiers telling you, get lost, little snot. Get lost. I had a big brother. Big brothers are jerks. Big brothers are mean. I can tell you another. That was a giant in my life. My dad's here, so I won't go into all the stories about that. Man, that's some giants to face. to knock down, drag out fist fights. I know I was always innocent. It was never my fault. It was always his fault. Amen. The last fight we ever had was one he didn't win. That's another story. But God does a crazy stuff through small things, through faithful people. The question that we have to wrestle with, struggle with, is are we going to be faithful? Are we going to remember to stop when we're facing a giant and take stock of the situation and remember who God is? That it's not about me, it's not about my gifts, it's not about my ability. It's about whether I can be faithful and whether I will face this giant. I've read this story many dozens of times. And I get chills every time I read David's response. Every time I read and encounter David's understanding and view of who God is facing this giant. It starts up in verse 36. He has defied the armies of the living God. He's remembering the God who did this will do this. Then he goes down to verse 45. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin. What can we substitute for words?" Now, we aren't facing literal giants trying to kill us. We aren't facing sword, spear, or javelin. Maybe we're facing a court order. Maybe we're facing a pink slip. Maybe we're facing the results of a test. We have all of these things that are coming at us, but what is David's response? I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. What's our heart? What's our perspective? What's our view of giants? We can get so overwhelmed by them that we can forget that God is sovereign and in control. That God already knows the outcome, that God has prepared us from where we've been to where we are, and He has placed us in this point for a purpose. There is a reason that we are facing this giant. There's a reason that we've come up against this obstacle. Another thing that I love about the story is in verse 48. It says, as Goliath moved closer to attack, David ran to face Goliath. David ran. Are you facing your giants? Are you running after them in the confidence and the power of the Holy Spirit in your life, believing that God has prepared you, believing that God has equipped you to face and defeat the giant that you're facing? And again, it's not about us, and David acknowledges that in the story. It's not about me, David says. It's about who my God is. It's about me being faithful and obedient to Him, and I'm going to be obedient to what He has called me to do. He has placed me in this position. David didn't ask for it. David didn't look for it. But David was faithful. He remembered the past. He remembered the line of the very thing. It's nothing compared to what God's already done in life. We can get so consumed with fear. We can get so consumed with stress and worry about these giants when God has already prepared us to face them. God has already prepared you to face the giants that you're facing. To confront the giant. He has prepared you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there. If He didn't believe in your ability, and not just in your ability, but in your ability to be faithful, He wouldn't have placed you there. But when we run to the battle line, when we run to face our giants, God uses faithful people. You don't have to have special skill, you don't have to have special ability. All you have to believe is in a special God who will do amazing things through faithful people. So in your giant, will you be faithful? Now, I look at this story again, and I see the temptation for Saul, temptation for the Israelite army to retreat and surrender the ground that they had gained already. To surrender ground to the enemy, to surrender ground to the Philistines. If they had turned around and ran. They had accomplished something. They had gone out, they had faced, they had won. They turned around and ran, they would have surrendered all of that ground. The same thing is true in our life. If we run from our giants, if we run from those things that God has put in our path, if we turn around and we don't believe and trust in God's faithfulness and His sovereignty and His ability, if we turn and run, we've just lost all that ground we've gained, and we've got to take it all back. So the giants you're facing, we can thank God for them. We can thank Him for the way He has prepared us. When Becky and I were getting ready to talk about moving and coming to Port Huron, we talked about opportunity, we talked about a move, we talked about our kids, we talked about the change, we talked about a lot of things. What do you think part of our discussion was? Past. And how we'd seen God work through our moves. And even going back, when we were going through this process, I'm not sure how much I thought about it before, but even going back to when I was a child. And moving when I was a child at 6 years old. Remembering that. Remembering how good the move was. And then moving to college and moving houses. At one time I had to get directions from college to come home because Mom and Dad had moved when I was in college. I had to get directions because I didn't know where we lived. Where's home? Thankfully, they told me the right address. They probably had a discussion about that. But so, as Becky and I were talking about this move, we looked back and we remembered God's faithfulness and we remembered how He worked and remembered the examples that we had to draw from, how God went through it all, and God prepared it all. The same thing I can promise you, I can guarantee is true in your life. That you can look back and you can see God's faithfulness. You can see His deliverance. You can see the way that He's worked. You can see how He's prepared you. So as you face this giant that may seem insurmountable, you've already faced giants. You've already faced obstacles. You've already faced those things that you didn't think you could accomplish before, but you did. So we thank God for giants. We thank Him for the way that He's prepared us and put us in this place to honor Him, to glorify Him. That's our goal as His followers, right? Our goal is to honor and glorify God. I shared that last week, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Chief end of the mission is to glorify God. These giants are to equip you, but yet it's an opportunity for you to honor and glorify God. Will you face, will you run towards your giants? Will you believe God has prepared you? Will you remember what God has done for you in the past? Will you choose to face your giants in the power and the strength of the Holy Spirit? We're going to close with a song. We're going to wrap this up, and we're going to go home. And one of the things about giants is, like I said, they're persistent. Just because you have faith, and just because you believe, and just because you pray, doesn't mean they're going to go away. But I can't promise you that you can defeat them. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know when it's going to happen. But I can guarantee you and I can promise you that through faithfulness, God delivers. And God will honor and God will bless. So as you leave this place, some of you may be walking into a giant. You know what the giant is as you leave and walk through these doors. How will you face that giant? Maybe as we just close in the song, maybe you just want to stay seated and you just want to pray. You just want to ask God, help me remember. Encourage me with your faithfulness. Encourage me with a good memory to recall those things, those ways that you've shown in the past. And be encouraged this morning. The giants you're facing are defeatable with the power and the help of the Holy Spirit. Let's stand together if you like. I'd like to remain seated, that's fine. Let's close with this.